For thousands of years, the world believed it knew exactly who the Berbers were. But a small vial of ancient blood just proved almost everyone wrong. If this story pulls at something in you, something about roots, about belonging, about where you truly come from, stay close. Because by the end of this, you might look at your own history a little differently too. Picture North Africa, not the version you see in postcards, not the sand dunes and camel silhouettes against an orange sky. Picture it thousands of years ago, mountains covered in green, valleys full of rivers, forests where lions once walked. This was the ancient home of a people the world would later call Berbers. But here is the strange part. The people who actually lived there never called themselves that name. They called themselves Amazigh. It means free people, free men, free souls, a name filled with pride, a name that carried the weight of identity, land, and survival. For centuries, the world outside decided who the Berbers were, not the Berbers themselves. Historians wrote them into footnotes, empires wrote them into conquest stories, and slowly, a simple, convenient version of their identity became the accepted truth. You have probably heard this common version before, even if you did not know it had a name. The story goes like this. The Berbers were just Arabs who changed a little over time. Or they were wandering desert tribes with no real deep roots. Or they were a mysterious in-between people. Not quite African, not quite Middle Eastern, not quite anything solid, just a blur on the map. A people without a clear origin. That version spread across books, classrooms, and casual conversations for generations. It felt neat. It felt simple. It gave people an easy box to place an entire civilization into. But real history is rarely that neat. And now, thanks to modern DNA research, that simple story is falling apart piece by piece. Because when scientists finally began digging into the deep genetic code of North African peoples, what they found did not match the old assumptions at all. It revealed something far older, far more complex, far more human. Let's slow down for a second, because this is where the mystery truly begins. For a long time, many assumed Berber identity was mostly shaped by later migrations. People believed that outside groups arrived, settled, and eventually became the Berbers through mixing over time. It sounded logical on the surface. Civilizations do mix, cultures do blend. But logical is not always true. When researchers studied ancient skeletal remains and matched them against DNA patterns of North African communities today, something surprising appeared. The roots go back much deeper than most people ever imagined. Some genetic evidence suggests that certain North African lineages date back tens of thousands of years, long before most of the migration's history books focus on. Let that sink in for a moment. This means the ancestors of Berber communities were not simply the result of one wave of people passing through. Some of their genetic threads may stretch back to populations who were already living in North Africa long before recorded history even began. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. If the roots go back that far, some historians believe part of the answer lies in who controlled the narrative. For a long stretch of history, North Africa was written about mostly by outsiders, Roman writers, Arab historians, later European colonizers. Each group described the Berbers through their own lens, their own interests, their own assumptions. And when a large civilization writes about a smaller one from the outside, details get lost, complexity gets flattened. A rich, layered identity becomes a simple label used for maps and administration. This is where the emotional weight of this story really begins to build, because identity is not just a historical detail. It is personal. It is family. It is the language your grandmother spoke to you as a child. It is the songs sung at weddings. It is the patterns woven into old textiles that carry meaning passed down for generations. When outsiders simplify a people's identity, they are not just changing a textbook line. They are quietly erasing pieces of a living culture. And for a long time, many Berber communities lived with a strange kind of identity fog. Told they were one thing by empires, told they were another thing by colonizers, told they were something else entirely by modern nations built on top of their ancestral lands. Now here is the first real curiosity loop opening in front of us. If DNA is now showing these deep, ancient roots, why did it take this long for the truth to surface? The answer connects to something bigger than Berber history alone. It connects to how science itself has evolved. For most of modern history, genetic research was extremely limited. Early DNA studies mostly focused on population groups that were easier to access, easier to fund, and often more connected to Western academic institutions. This means the full genetic story of the Berbers is still being written, even today. Some researchers believe this ongoing research still has major discoveries ahead of it. Others say we're only scratching the surface. But even the pieces uncovered so far are enough to reshape how we understand this identity. Because the emerging picture is not one simple origin. It is layered. It is complex. It is, like North Africa itself, a bridge between worlds. Genetic studies suggest ancient North African populations carried unique lineages not fully identical to sub-Saharan African populations, and not fully identical to Middle Eastern populations either. Instead, evidence points to a distinct, deep-rooted North African genetic identity that existed long before those later migrations blended into it. In simple words, the Berbers were not a leftover mix of other peoples. They were, in many ways, a foundation, a root system others eventually connected to. Let that idea breathe for a moment, because it flips the old story completely. For generations, people were told the Berbers were shaped by others, but the deeper truth suggests the opposite in many ways. Long before large migrations moved through North Africa, there were already people living there, adapting to the land, developing their own customs, their own early forms of art, their own connection to that specific soil and mountain range and coastline. If you have made it this far into the story, you are already asking the right question. So let's ask it directly right now. Some historians argue it comes down to how history gets prioritized. Ancient Egypt captured global fascination early. Roman history dominated Western education. Later empires focused attention elsewhere. Meanwhile, Indigenous North African history often stayed in the background, treated more like a footnote to bigger empires, rather than its own powerful, independent story. This is where the emotional core of the story deepens even further. Because imagine living in a homeland your ancestors occupied for thousands of years, yet constantly being viewed as a side character in someone else's history book. Imagine watching outside powers write, rewrite, and simplify your identity again and again, while your own oral traditions, your own language, your own cultural memory, again and again, while your own oral traditions, your own language, your own cultural memory carried a much older and richer truth all along. That is not just a historical inconvenience. That is generations of quiet erasure. And yet, despite all of that inconvenience, that is generations of quiet erasure. And yet, despite all of that, the Amazigh identity survived. Their language, often called Tamazight, still exists today. Their traditions, their symbols, their music, their patterns still live on in communities across Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and beyond. Even through waves of conquest, colonization, and cultural pressure, something ancient refused to disappear completely. That alone is a powerful human story. Survival is not always loud. Sometimes survival like a symbol stitched into fabric that outsiders overlook, but that carries deep ancestral meaning to those who know its history. If a story like this makes you think about your own family's hidden history, even in a small way, you are not alone in that feeling. Many people watching stories like this start wondering what pieces of their own identity were simplified, misunderstood, or forgotten over time. Now let's step into the next curiosity loop, because the DNA story does not stop here. Some genetic studies focusing on North African populations have revealed something else surprising: traces of ancient connections stretching toward the Iberian Peninsula, meaning parts of modern Spain and Portugal. This suggests that thousands of years ago, movement between North Africa and parts of southern Europe happened much earlier and much more significantly than many previously assumed. This challenges another old boundary line people often imagine in their heads: the idea that Africa and Europe were always separated by a hard cultural wall. In reality, the Mediterranean Sea acted more like a bridge than a barrier for a long stretch of ancient history. People moved, ideas moved, genes moved. This means Berber ancestry is not just a North African story. It is part of a much larger human story about movement, adaptation, and connection across continents that we often imagine as being much more separate than they actually were. Some researchers even suggest parts of the world, meaning this region may have played a much bigger role in early human history than commonly discussed. Let that idea sit there for a moment, because it is a big one. A region often reduced to a simple label in old textbooks may have actually been one of the more important crossroads in early human movement. If you're starting to feel like the story of the Berbers is bigger than you were ever taught, that feeling is exactly the point of everything DNA research is now revealing. So let's bring the story back to something deeply human again, because facts alone do not create meaning. Meaning comes from what those facts represent to real people living today. For many Amazigh people, these genetic discoveries are not just interesting data points. They are validation. Validation of stories their grandparents told them. Validation of a deep connection to the land that outsiders often questioned or dismissed. Validation of an identity that survived despite centuries. About science finally catching up to what oral tradition had been saying all along. Because for generations, elders passed down stories of deep ancestral roots, of belonging to this land long before empires arrived. And for generations, those stories were often treated as folklore rather than history. Now, modern genetic research is quietly confirming pieces of what those oral traditions always carried. This is where identity and science meet in a powerful way. Not identity created by science, but identity finally respected by science. Now here comes the third major curiosity loop, and this one touches something even more personal. If ancient DNA reveals such deep, complex roots, what does that mean for how we define identity itself? Because for a long time, identity was treated like a simple checkbox: Arab or African, European or Middle Eastern, one category or another, cleanly separated, easy to sort. But real human history rarely fits into clean boxes. The Berber story shows us that identity can be layered. It can hold multiple truths at once. People can carry deep indigenous roots while also absorbing later cultural influences through trade, conquest, marriage, and migration. None of those layers erase the other. It extends far beyond North Africa, because in many parts of the world, similar oversimplified stories were placed onto other cultures too. Indigenous peoples across different continents have often faced the same pattern. Outside powers arrive, write history through their own lens, and slowly a much older, richer identity becomes reduced to a simplified label used mostly for convenience. The Berber DNA story becomes a mirror for something much bigger, a reminder that history written by outsiders often needs to be re-examined, respected, and in many cases, corrected. If this idea is resonating with you, imagine how it feels for someone whose entire ancestral identity was shaped by outside assumptions for generations, and who is only now watching science help restore a more accurate picture. If that thought moves something in you, let it settle for a second before we continue. Now let's talk about why. This moment right now matters so much. We are living during a rare period in history a few decades ago, are now allowing scientists to study extremely old remains with much greater accuracy. Each year, new samples get analyzed. Each year, small new pieces of the puzzle appear. This means the Berber story is not fully finished being told. It is still unfolding, still being written quite literally, one strand of ancient DNA at a time. Some researchers believe future studies may reveal even deeper connections, additional evolved across North Africa over tens of thousands of years. Other researchers urge caution, reminding us that ancient DNA research is complex, sample sizes are sometimes limited, and conclusions can shift as more evidence emerges. Historians and scientists still debate certain details, and that is a healthy, important part of real science. Nothing here should be treated as a final, absolute answer. It should be treated as an evolving, honest, ongoing search for truth. But even with that careful uncertainty, one thing becomes clear. The old, oversimplified version of Berber identity no longer holds up. The world can no longer comfortably say the Berbers were simply one thing, borrowed from somewhere else without deep roots of their own. The evidence, layer by layer, is telling a much older, much richer story. Let's take a breath here, because we are approaching the emotional center of everything we have uncovered. Think about what it truly means for people to be misdefined for centuries, only to have modern science slowly restore a more accurate, respectful version of their history. Think about how many other cultures around the world are still waiting for that same kind of restoration. Think about how identity is not just about ancient bones and DNA strands. It is about dignity. It is about being seen accurately, not through the convenient lens of outsiders, but through truth. The Amazigh people carried their identity forward through language, through art, through oral memory, through resilience, long before modern science offered any kind of confirmation. Their pride in being called free people was never dependent on outside validation. But there is still something deeply meaningful about the world finally beginning to see clearly what they always knew quietly within themselves. If you have stayed with this story until now, you have walked through thousands of years of history in just a few minutes. You have seen how a name given from the outside can shape how a people gets remembered. You have seen how easily historical narratives get simplified. You have seen how science is now slowly reopening old assumptions and replacing them with a much deeper, more honest picture. And maybe somewhere in this story you started thinking about your own history too, about the stories your family tells, about the pieces of your identity that outsiders may have simplified or misunderstood over time, about how many of us carry deeper roots than the short version of our story usually admits. Because in many ways, this is not just a story about the Berbers. It is a reminder that history is never as simple as the first version we are told. It is a reminder that identity is layered, resilient, and often deeper than outside labels ever allowed it to be. And it is a reminder that sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly inside a strand of ancient DNA, waiting patiently for thousands of years until the world was finally ready to listen. The Berbers were never simply what the old stories claimed. They were something older, something deeper, something far more human. And maybe that is the real lesson hiding inside all of this. Every people, every family, every one of us carries a story deeper than the simple version the world assumes at first glance. The only question left is this: how many other truths are still waiting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone to finally listen closely enough to hear them?